You never fired a weapon in anger. That's what you tell yourself at 53, sitting in a garden in Northern Virginia watching your grandchildren chase each other between the hedges. The sun is warm. The coffee is good. Your hands don't shake. But you know what those hands authorized. An authorization, you learned long ago, is just distance with paperwork. You grew up in a town that produced two things: grain and quiet. Your father was a county surveyor. Methodical, precise, emotionally absent in the way that men of his generation understood as dignity. Your mother taught elementary school and read 3 newspapers a day, which in that town marked her as eccentric. You inherited both of them equally, the precision and the hunger for a world larger than the one outside the window. You were not bullied. You were not celebrated. You existed in the particular invisibility of the capable but unremarkable. Good grades, no close friends, a bedroom full of atlases and history books that nobody asked about. At 15, you read a biography of a man who had shaped the outcome of 3 wars without ever appearing in the index of any history book written about them. You read it twice. You understood something then that you couldn't articulate yet, that the most consequential people were the ones who left no fingerprints. At 18, you were accepted to a university on partial scholarship. You studied political science and linguistics. You learned Farsi because it was difficult. You learned Russian because it was necessary. You kept both to yourself. Senior year, a professor asked you to stay after class. He said you had an unusual quality, that you listened more than you spoke, and when you spoke, you were never wrong about people. He gave you a card. No name. Just a phone number. You called it 3 days later. The first meeting was in a hotel lobby in Washington. A man named Hargrove, mid-50s, unremarkable suit, eyes that never stopped moving while his face stayed entirely still. He bought you coffee. He asked you about your thesis. He asked you about your father. He asked you, very casually, what you would do if you knew something that could save lives but could never be spoken of publicly. You said you'd do it. He nodded like you'd confirm something he already knew. The process took 14 months, background investigation that reached into your childhood home, your mother's phone records, a neighbor you'd spoken to twice, psychological evaluations designed to appear like conversations, polygraphs administered by people who told you the polygraph wasn't the test. You passed everything, not because you were exceptional, because you were stable. In a world that selected for intensity, your stillness was the rarest thing in the room. The day you were formally brought in, there was no ceremony. A woman named Calloway handed you a badge in a basement corridor and said, "Welcome to the work. You'll never be able to explain what you do. That's the point." You felt for the first time in your life exactly placed. That feeling would sustain you for years. It would also make you blind to what you were being placed inside. The first 3 years were analysis. You sat in rooms with no windows and read reports from people whose names you never knew about events in countries you weren't cleared to name. You wrote assessments, you identified patterns, you were rarely wrong and you never said so. Your supervisor, a man who introduced himself only as Marsh, told you once that the most dangerous thing an analyst could be was confident. You asked why. He said, because confidence is the last thing before certainty, and certainty gets people killed. You remembered that. Year 2, you were moved to a team that interfaced with field operations, not running them. Not yet. Translating the gap between what was known and what was actionable. You began to understand the structure, not as it was described in any document, but as it actually functioned. The layers of deniability. The contractors who didn't exist, the budgets that weren't budgets. You attended your first briefing where a proposed operation was discussed. The objective was the disruption of a network in a country whose name was replaced in the transcript with a geographic coordinate. The method was indirect. The acceptable collateral was listed as a range. A range. You wrote nothing on your notepad during that meeting. Afterward, in the corridor, you stood at a window for 4 minutes before going back to your desk. You went back to your desk. You were 31 when an operation you helped design produced an outcome you hadn't modeled. The intelligence was solid. The analysis was yours. The target was legitimate, a logistics coordinator for a network that had moved materials responsible for 14 deaths in 2 countries. The operation was clean by the standards of clean. But there was a woman in the building. She wasn't in the intelligence file. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was the target's sister, visiting from the south of the country, and she was 26 years old. You learned about her on a Tuesday morning, reading the after-action report. You sat with that report for a long time. You did not cry. You did not report a crisis of conscience. You filed your assessment of the operational outcome and noted the intelligence gap as a variable requiring future protocol adjustment. That night you drove for 2 hours without a destination. You ended up at a rest stop on the highway, sitting in your car watching trucks pass. The protocol adjustment memo took you 4 days to write. It was 8 pages. It was thorough. It was, in some technical sense, your way of doing the only thing you were permitted to do. You understood then that the institution did not have a mechanism for what you were feeling. It had mechanisms for everything else. By 38, you were running a section. Not in the field. Never in the field. Your role was architecture, designing the frameworks within which other people made decisions in real time in places you would never visit. You reviewed proposals. You approved timelines. You managed a team of 11 analysts and 4 liaison officers whose names appeared in no directory. The weight of that shifted gradually, the way water carves stone, not in moments but in accumulation. There was an asset in Eastern Europe who had been providing intelligence for 7 years. His cover was compromised. The extraction window was 48 hours. The extraction was authorized. Then it wasn't a political calculation. 3 levels above you shifted the calculus. The window closed. The asset disappeared. The report used the word terminated in its administrative sense, but you knew what administrative meant. You wrote a formal objection. It was received, logged, and filed. Nothing changed. You began sleeping 4 hours a night. Not from guilt, from calculation. You were running probability models in your sleep. Your mind had stopped distinguishing between work and consciousness. Your marriage, which had survived 7 years of classified evenings and unexplained travel, did not survive year 8. Your wife said she felt she was living with someone who had decided to be a ghost while still physically present. She wasn't wrong. You signed the divorce papers in your office during a lunch break. You were on a call when they were handed to you. You initialed each page without stopping the call. At 46, there was a congressional inquiry, not into your section specifically, into the broader framework of covert authorization, the gap between what was approved by oversight and what was approved by the institution for itself. You were interviewed 3 times by investigators who understood perhaps 40% of what you told them, and you told them perhaps 40% of what you knew. That 40% was carefully chosen. It was truthful. It was incomplete. Afterward, a senior official called you into his office and said you had handled it well. You nodded. You understood that handling it well meant the institution remained intact and your role within it remained unexamined. 6 months later, you submitted your resignation. Not in protest, not with a statement. You submitted a standard form with a standard reason, personal, and gave 90 days notice and trained your replacement with complete professional thoroughness. Your last day was a Wednesday. A colleague brought a cake. You ate a slice and shook 11 hands and walked out through the same basement corridor where Calloway had handed you your badge 23 years earlier. The badge went into a drawer in a building that would eventually be demolished. You drove home. The house was quiet. You made dinner. You watched the news with the sound low. The news covered a situation in a region you recognized by its geographic coordinates. The coverage was incomplete in ways that only you could fully annotate. You turned it off. You consult now, occasionally, for firms that need someone who understands how governments think from the inside of the thinking rather than the outside of the result. You are careful about what you accept. You are more careful about what you say. You live in the house in Northern Virginia. The garden was her wife's idea originally. She planted it before she left, and you maintained it after she did, which was either stubbornness or sentiment. You've never fully decided. Your children are adults. They know you worked for the government in an analytical capacity. They know you can't discuss it. They've stopped asking, which is a form of acceptance and also a form of distance that you understand is partly your doing. Your granddaughter, 4 years old, relentless, extraordinary, asked you last week what you used to do at work. You said you used to help people make decisions. She asked if they were good decisions. You said you tried to make sure they were. She considered this and then ran back across the garden and you watched her go. And the question stayed with you in the way that only a question from someone who has not yet learned to stop asking can stay with you. The truth, the one you spent years assembling into something you can hold without it destroying the rest, is this: you served something real. The threat was real. The necessity was sometimes real. And the people you worked alongside were, most of them, genuinely trying to do something that mattered. And the institution also consumed things it should not have consumed, made trades it had no right to make, optimized for its own continuity in ways that had nothing to do with the values it claimed to protect. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the entire architecture of your professional life was built on the space between them. You were not a villain, you were not a hero, you were precise and stable, and you went back to your desk. That is the most honest sentence you have. The garden is quiet, the children are inside now. A single bird lands on the fence post, looks at nothing and leaves. You finish your coffee. You were never in the index. That was always the point. If this made you think, you already know what to do.